Welcome back to Radio Gender, your little jukebox in the pronoun wasteland. I'm Miss Twincon and I'm here for you. Here is today's letter. Dear Miss Twincon, your elf-coded broadcasts have given me a lot of confidence in figuring out my own identity, brick by brick. But the answer to one question seems to elude me. How can you be sure of who you are? Well, partner, I think that might just be one of the most fundamental questions a person can ask of themselves. For me, I think certainty might be an awfully fickle thing. As long as you keep on trucking, I'm sure that you'll get where you need to go. And now the news. A Seattle polycule today fought off a band of toxic passoids armed only. Hi, it's been too long. In my last video, I was so extraordinarily confident that I was going to be able to crank out a video every single month. Then the world ended in many ways, and it makes everything quite difficult. A lot more difficult than you might want when you are trying to, make a living for yourself. There's too much life for me to make life happen. But while I have been away, I have been bombarded with many questions about the uniqueness of my perspective. There are, of course, certain things that only I can answer. But who am I, really? And how do you know who you are? Today we are talking about identity. It's almost like one of my older videos that no one watched. But it's not going to be a transgender type of video. Gender is only one aspect of identity after all, and when you're dealing with large topics like that, it's nice to stay concise, which is why the runtime of this video is... I don't know how long it's going to be because I haven't tried it yet. Is it going to be short? I hope it's going to be short. An amendment to that though is that we are going to start off there, because if you're watching this video, odds are that you are bisexual and also have more than one gender. And also, it's a type of identity that everyone has been talking about quite a lot recently. And there are aspects of the transgender issue that work as a sort of microcosm of the larger question of identity as a whole. What does it mean to be a person is a very large question. But by answering the question, what does it mean to be transgender? we may come to an answer that covers both. But take my opinion with a grain of salt. I am, after all, just one person. Being trans and making the kind of content that I do on the internet means being bombarded with questions that are both well-meaning and critiquing from all sorts of people who have questions about what it means to be trans and what it means to be a person in the world whom is trans, which is not quite the same thing. The main point of contention seems to be, by quite a lot of people, how can you be sure? And that's from any perspective. How can an individual be sure that they are trans and not making a mistake by transitioning? If we cannot be fully sure, then maybe we shouldn't let people transition. I mean, especially if they're kids, or maybe not at all. But also from the perspective of someone who is not trans, how can I be sure that the person who I see as gender non-conforming walking into the women's bathroom is trans or not? What if they are just a man in disguise? Well, since we can't be sure, then we should just not let anyone gender non-conforming into the women's bathroom. Anyone! I wonder what my neighbors think. My neighbors don't speak English, so. In both cases, the question is, how can you be sure? And that is a question that I'm going to try to answer in this video. The answer might surprise you. Or, if we are generalizing the question, how can you be sure you are the person you are? This is not an easy question, which means I'm fully confident that I can bang this one out in a couple of minutes. Can you tell I'm kind of pent up with like content energy? I've made a video in over a year. Do you remember I exist? Does anyone even want to watch this video? Why not come back with answering one of life's toughest questions? Fuck it! To do that effectively, however, we need to break down the question a little bit. What does it mean to be sure about anything? And we also need to talk about what it means to be. And in the question of identity, what it means to be you. Now, if you're a philosopher, you might disagree with some of the takes I have, but I don't care because I'm correct.
I think I'm much more humble than you would understand.
Can I call Abby? I mean, I know Abby. I should just call her Abby. Beep, boop, 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 boop. Hey, do philosophers talk about identity, like, ever? No. Alright, cool. That means we can do whatever the fuck we want. Let's start with some ancient Greeks. Ancient Greeks. What am I talking about? Is this Dancing Queen? I've never seen that movie. So then, what is bee? A bee is a small insect, and according to all known laws of aviation, when we talk about things being in terms of identity, we often talk about who we are as being separate from who we be physically. The atoms that make us up is not who we are, it's our interests, our personality, our identity. It is something different from the physical meat and bones of who we are. But why is that? Well, don't worry, because I won't be talking too many old quotes from old philosophers, because I'm a cool YouTuber like that. I will, however, talk a little bit about philosophy, because God forbid you can do anything on YouTube without it. So, the philosophy behind why things are is called ontology. And yes, we're starting with ontology because it matters. Parmenides from Ereria had some ideas about why things that are, and things that aren't. Yay! I love ancient Greek philosophy because you can really like feel that they kind of started from nothing. Things that are. Everything is made of fire. So far, easy to understand. I like this guy. This in turn means that everything is static and unchanging because something cannot come from something that doesn't exist because it doesn't exist. So everything already has to be. So it is unchanging and static, and everything that has been is already is. So everything is just is, which means change doesn't happen. If you saw something change, no, you didn't. You just thought that you did, which is an argument I wish I could use like ever. Like, if you didn't like my video, yes you did. You just imagined that you didn't. He explains his reasoning in a poem, which I won't recite to you right now because it's very long and I've already got my point across, but in it, he talks about the way of knowing the world, specifically the way of truth and the way of opinion. And in his reasoning, the only thing that really matters is the way of truth, because the way of opinion, which includes like your senses and your emotions and things like that, that doesn't matter. Fact, don't care about your feelings. Or in ancient Greek, like, huh? Now you might be asking, what the fuck does this have to do with identity? We'll get there. Parmenides stands in contrast to Heraclitus, who talks about everything being in flux. He compares the universe and everything that is to a river, and saying that even though we know that rivers exist, you can never step into the same river twice. And you get the analogy, you know, because the water flows, you're like, it's not the same water, it's a different river, kind of, but not really, you know? Therefore, nothing really is anything, but everything is always changing. It's in flux. It's always becoming something else. Even though we may perceive things as being, what we're really seeing is what it is right now. It might not be that some other time. But the problem with Heraclitus' view is, if everything is always changing, how can we know anything? If everything is changing, that means that what you know might no longer be knowledge when the thing has changed. So, did you ever really know anything? Now you might be asking, what the fuck does this have to do with identity? We'll get there! Well, these theories lay the groundwork for how we identify and label stuff, including, eventually, ourselves. What does it mean to be a person? Is not that difficult from describing what it means to be a rock, or how it is to be a trans person. Now, you might be saying, is this question really that complicated? Do we really need to bring up Parmenides and Heraclitus? The obvious answer to the question, who am I, is that I am me, me is I, but that is a circular argument, and that does not fly here in the pseudo-academic sphere of YouTube philosophy videos. No ma'am. Because ancient Greek thinkers did eventually encounter a bit of a problem. Human beings are pretty similar to each other. There's not that much difference between us except for aesthetic stuff. Underneath the surface, we're all very similar to each other. Don't come at me with neurology yet. We'll get there too. I promise we'll get to the brain. But overall, pretty similar. And yet, people can act radically different from each other. They identify in radically different ways. What is it that truly makes us unique? Where is this uniqueness stored? The ancient Greeks had a lot of ideas about where personality traits and, you know, things like that were stored in the body. Remember, they don't have like advanced MRIs in ancient Athens. So they have various theories. You may have heard, for example, that passion is stored in the heart and pee is stored in the balls. These ideas are of course true, but there are of course more traits that we today know are stored in the brain. Well, this is where we start talking about the soul. The idea of the soul is that there is an aspect of personhood, not necessarily just your own, that exists on a non-physical level. Now, there are many theories about the soul, and they're not all compatible with each other. Pythagoras has a very different idea of the soul than, like, your local Catholic preacher. But to many people, the idea of the soul is that the part of you that is essentially you, the part that makes you, you, is the soul. The soul is an unchanging, non-physical core or essence of what makes you, you. And depending on your specific version of the soul, it can be completely unaffected by things like physical changes and age or even death. But it's been around for a long time, still exists a lot today. And for many people, it's quite comforting. There's a comfort in feeling like you know that there is a part of you that will exist after you die, and that that is also true for the people that you love. It's nice and comforting and reassuring in that way. One problem with the soul theory, though, is can't prove it. No evidence. Checkmate, theorists. Checkmate, thesis. Checkmate, theists. So then what? Well, in the 17th century, John Locke had some ideas about mind. And his theories are that it's not the soul that makes you you, but rather psychological continuance. Ooh. What makes you you is the memories that you have. The experiences that you've done, and remembering those experiences is what makes you uniquely you. No one else has your memories or your experiences, which means that they are different from you. Your uniqueness and your identity stems from that lived long experience, which makes some sense. Imagine that a person you know loses all of their memories. Their entire life experience deleted in one moment. Maybe they're in a coma or in an episode of House or something. Would they still be the same person they was before? I mean, on some level, of course they are the same person. But are they? Maybe they would become a different person. In one sense, that person would still inhabit that body. If you believe in a soul, that person might still have that same soul, but it would not be the same person who you did things with. Right? They would have no memory of doing those things. And it's true. You could be splitting hairs here and talking about the fact that, yes, even though they were that person who did those things with you, they just don't remember it. That doesn't make them a different person. They just don't remember it, which, sure. But we're talking about philosophy here, so we're allowed to get a little crazy. And there are some problems with this theory, of course. What about memories that you forgot? What about false memories? They would make you up, but they would be false, which means that a person part of you would be wrong in some way. And false memories happen all the time, so who knows how much of my personality is actually fake. Or what about people with cognitive decline? Like, is a person with Alzheimer's still the same person they used to be? It makes this theory of mind a little bit unnerving, and I don't love it that much. Well, in the 18th century, David Hume could outconsume quite a lot of other philosophers in terms of his theory of mind, which is not necessarily psychological continuance or the soul, or many of the other theories that were floating around at the time, but rather all sorts of shit. This is called the bundle theory of mind, and it talks about the idea that what makes you you is a overlapping and continuously changing and constant fury of a bunch of different impressions and sensations and memories and stuff. Hume argues there is no such thing as a constant, unified, unchanging self. We are instead a collection of overlapping constant experiences, always moving, always changing and evolving, always being, and even though we might feel as a unified self, unchanging self, maybe we're not. You are not the same person you was as a child. At all. You are only what you are right now, and that's it, baby. My dog. Now, you might say, Mia, all of this is bullshit. All of this is mumbo jumbo. What are you even talking about? Well, it is maybe a little bit like that, but that's how it is. So here's where we need to talk about the physical theory of mind. Basically, there is no such thing as a separate self detached from what the body is. What is you are only the physical impulses that are interpreted by your brain. Your brain is you. You is your brain. Your brain is you, boo. And there's a lot of support for this. If you don't have a brain, you're not going to be around. No brain, no you. Bing, bang, boom, baby, that's evidence. But there are some problems here as well. Because what does it even mean to have a brain? A brain is simply a collection of a bunch of cells, and those cells are made up of atoms. But where's the you part? Is the you created in the electrical impulses between those nerves? Because I have certainly killed a significant portion of my brain cells over the years, but does that mean that there is a part of me that no longer exists? How much of that impulse do I need to be? This means that I could remove one cell from my brain and still be me. Could I remove 2 cells? How about 4? How about 100? How about 10,000? Where does the line go between me being and me not being? Could I imitate one of those brain cells? There's something called the replacement hypothesis, where you could gradually replace one neuron in your brain with an artificial neuron, something man-made that would do everything that the human brain cell would, but artificial. If you kept on doing that, when do you stop being you? When does your consciousness cease to be? There's a famous example from Star Trek that kind of illustrates this idea quite well. In Star Trek, because I wanted to save money on shuttlecraft, there is a device called the transporter. And it works by dematerializing whoever steps into it and then rematerializing them on some other planet where Kirk is presumably gonna fuck some alien. And the problem is the person who steps out the other side you? Or is it a perfectly imitated copy of you? There's a bunch of fiction that kind of deals with this idea of consciousness never really being able to transfer, but where do you draw that line? The transporter might seem quite obvious. It dematerializes your brain entirely and then rematerializes it. But remember, what if you did it one cell at a time? Would your consciousness travel along? If the transporter moves one atom from the starship to the planet one by one, would it be you? Does that matter? If it only destroys your brain and then rebuilds it atom by atom identically, but using other atoms, would that matter? Would that be you? The problem here is, of course, that we don't really know that much about consciousness as a thing. Consciousness is a very mysterious idea, and philosophically, you might even argue that it doesn't even exist. I don't know enough, so I decided to ask an expert. Can the Star Trek transporter make you pregnant? If you believe in a soul, well, the soul is not a physical part of you, so it would be unaffected by the dematerialization, so that would still be you. The person coming out on the other side would also have all of your memories and experiences, so that would also still be you. But the brain might not be you. These discussions of viewing the mind as being different from the body is called mind-body dualism. And it stands in contrast to monism, which states that there is no division between the mind and the body is the mind. Viewing the brain as the sole center of identity and selfness is a type of monist view of the world. And despite being the one that is, I would say, most favored by evidence, it doesn't actually apply to how most people view themselves. Most people still, either on an unconscious or on an unconscious level, still view the self to be something distinct from the meat and bones, whether you believe in a soul or something else. Now, there are a ton of versions of both the dualistic and monistic views of mind, so I won't go through them all. But I mention it because I still want you to learn something from this video, even though I don't want to talk about it too much. But Mia, why are you talking about mind-body dualism? Well, because when we talk about trans identity, you can oftentimes see a split in the community of how to talk about why transness exists. Some people obviously say that, well, gender dysphoria is a symptom that develops in the brain, and I'm treating gender dysphoria with certain medications that are proven to work, and therefore, like, I don't have to invoke a soul or anything like that. their mind is trans because of their brain doing the brain stuff. But that is still a very medicalist view that you are doing it because of a physical reaction that is happening in your brain, and it doesn't work for everyone. Some people will refer to their transness as adjusting their physical body with their inner soul. Maybe not soul in the Christian sense, but the soul as in a non-physical part of what you are, which means that these are not just different views in how we view transness, but it's actually a different worldview of where we see the mind come from. Did you catch on to the point where we can extrapolate trans identity to other identity? I got you, fucker! And these questions are important because while they deal with the emergence of consciousness, they don't necessarily talk about why these consciousnesses that we all have do the things they do. Sure, biological realities are real and they exist, and that's not wrong, but names aren't biological, and we care a lot about those. So, despite having asked the great philosophers of the past of why we are who we are, we still don't have an answer to the question: how can you be sure you are who you are? How can you be sure you are who you are? How can you be sure? How can you be sure you are who you are? Who am I? How can you be sure you are who you are? How can you be sure you are who you are? Who am I? Who are you watching this video? It's been a while since I made one. Can you tell? I ask myself the same thing occasionally, especially recently. And I know that this question is quite broad. We need to break that question down a little bit because that's a bit vague. And I'm going to use my own personal unknowns. Because God forbid you have a mental breakdown without monetizing it. Otherwise, what's the fucking point? So, let's break it down. What does it mean? What does it mean to be? Identity is typically described using an assortment of labels, and they are simply just ways to describe the world around us. We typically identify ourselves and other people using words. This is like kindergarten. And words are made up of letters. Who we are and how we identify ourselves and others is colored entirely by language. Because while we can philosophize and think a lot about internal experiences and identities, the only way we have to describe those experiences and identities is by using language. Sure, we could all try to figure out elaborate Greek logic puzzles to try to illustrate our internal identities, but we are not all funded by the King of Croton, and we don't all live in caves. Most people have real jobs and have to suffice with the language that they have, which, remember this, identity is extraordinarily similar to language. And this means that similar rules tend to apply. There are prescriptivists and descriptivists, and they have different attitudes for how labels should be used. What makes a person, let's say, an architect? Picture in your mind an architect. Rotate that architect in your mind. What makes that person an architect? A prescriptivist might say that an architect is only an architect if they do architect. And therefore people will use the word to describe what they are. There is a meaning to the word architect and they are doing it, therefore they are that thing. In terms of identity, they would say that identity is not something chosen, but instead something that other people use to describe you, using rules of nature. I am an architect. The word architect, along with the ideas of career, education, and other contexts that we associate with the word architect, are things that this person has self-identified with enough that that is how they present themselves to other people. I identify as an architect. I identify as a YouTuber, but I grant you, I don't think that YouTubers should be allowed in women's bathrooms. The problem with that, though, is that words change meaning depending on their context and their place in time and history and culture and yada, yada, yada. My go-to example when describing this is the word transsexual, because back in the 90s and even in the early 2000s and 2010s, back when I got started, 4 billion years ago, transsexual used to mean specifically a trans person who has undergone the surgery. Some people still use it like that today, but some people don't, because, you know, trans people in general it's not a monolith. And because there's much of a greater overlap between all what we would today call trans people, we just call them trans people, and no one really makes the distinction about whether or not someone has had bottom surgery yet or not. But that was the norm for a certain period of time. So what does it mean if someone were to identify as transsexual? What does that mean? Are they potentially describing something that they see as an objective reality? You know, a person who has undergone bottom surgery is something that is describing an act, an empirical fact that you can, I don't know, check if you're nasty. Or is that a label that they are describing to themselves, regardless of any connection to the real world? This is where we need to talk about Ludwig Wittgenstein, because everyone who would care about that has already left the second I mentioned Heraclitus. Wittgenstein and a bunch of other people argue that words derive their meaning from their use in the world. And depending on how we use the word can adopt or change or get new traits or lose traits. Wittgenstein argues that the meaning of a word is its use in language, which has a twofold meaning. One, it means that words do not necessarily have an inherent meaning. Words are stuff we made up, so they don't mean anything unless we decide that they do. So they mean what we decide that they do. But it also means that they only have meaning when we use them with other people. You can have an entirely internal language with words that mean whatever they mean, and that's fine. You can do that. If a word has a unique meaning only to you in the secrets of your own mind, that's fine, but that doesn't matter. And this has a lot of meaning for identity, because it means that the words we have available to us are limited by the meaning that they have in the society in which we live. Not every language, in fact, no language, can capture the uniqueness of every mind or the vast complexity of the human soul, which means that no matter how we choose to identify ourselves, we are simplifying ourselves down to a type of identity that we can then communicate to others. If a significant amount of people define a word differently than how they used to, then that word does gain new meaning. And that also means that the way that we can identify ourselves will also evolve along with the word. But those words don't just derive meaning from how we think about them in the secrets of our mind, they also get meaning from how we use them. How do the people who we label with certain words use those words? If you are an architect, not only are you going to just exist in the world with that label, you are going to want to do things like draw buildings and design structures and whatnot that reinforce the label of architect. People reactualize the labels and identities that they have, or rather that they would want to have. You may have heard of gender performativity, which is also this, but in regards to gender. But if you want to simplify this idea, just imagine that architect is a gender. This means that the toolkit we have to identify ourselves and other people really is quite flimsy. A person who's trying to figure out their own identity will be limited by the words that they have available to them. And that they might go on to reinforce the labels that they have used, which will then go on to influence how other people will define those words and how then they will identify themselves. It becomes a feedback loop of meaning and labels and identity, even though it might not fully represent the core essence of what they were trying to represent. So now that we got the fucking Wittgenstein mention out of the way, which I don't know if that was relevant, let's move on. But you know what? Now it's just you and me, baby. Now it's just you and me and the hardcore fans left on this YouTube channel. Please subscribe. I haven't made a video in so long. I need to get back in the game. I don't like books. So instead of talking about this in terms of academic literature, I am instead going to explain this problem using the ancient art of personal analogy. A lot of philosophers out there today, Gene. It's a classic me and Mulder play, but is it gonna work out for him? Well, as you know, Gene, it's all about that follow-through. If she can concretize this down to an individual and personal level, I think we might see some results. It is a ballsy move, but it is a classic for a reason. You know, they did show a lot of promise in the preseason, but it has been a while since the major leagues. Do you think they have what it takes? It all depends on the unity of the team, but we can't also forget that it has been raining on the pitch, and that might play to their advantage if the audience is horny enough. We just have to wait and see. One thing is for sure though, she has got to bring this down into the more personal level, into that midfield. Theory is all good and well in the preseason, but on the pitch is all about how you play. And while we wait for the Act 2 meander, we of course want to give a word to our sponsor, Gender Ball, the only energy drink that is derived directly from the ball. Hi everyone. Now, before we talk about the transgender issue, which I know you all want to do because you're all gender confused bisexuals, I would instead like to talk about another personal analogy. So I got diagnosed with ADHD as an adult. I have the inattentive type, which means that instead of my mind going hyperactive, it just goes. For most of my life, I did not know that this was a thing. I did not know that I had it, and I honestly didn't understand much about the actual condition either. Which meant that I saw things that I now know are symptoms as just parts of my personality. I was, you know, inattentive, absent-minded, clumsy, forgetful, bad at cleaning, lazy, chronically late. You know the deal. All those traits got, you know, incorporated into how I saw myself. That's just how I am. After all, people are like that, so I'm just one of those people. There's nothing wrong with that, I didn't think. It doesn't have to be a neurodevelopmental disorder. But then I got diagnosed and I got medication, Vyvanse, lisdexamfetamine, and suddenly I became someone else. I started having a color-coded calendar. I became more confident. I became organized, extroverted, able to sit down for long periods of time and laser focus in on specific tasks.
Still on those meds, huh?
Yeah, they helped me to, think. Okay, time for an eyes open nap.
And I enjoyed reading more and cooking, and so, here's the question. Is that medicated me the real me? I mean, not really, right? Because if you're going from a purely physiological perspective, I am adding an outside influence, a type of stimulant, to alter the way that I am. Like, what is personality if we're not talking about the traits and behaviors and interests and the way that we operate around the world? So, am I still the real me? Did I kill the old Mia? This is a similar type of existential crisis to the one that I had when I started thinking about gender. And that's when I started thinking about making this video, and it's taken fucking ages. What I'm talking about here is a few things, but I'm primarily focused on internal self-identification. Personal internal identity is the one you have when you view yourself, your perceptual self-image, your mental view of your personal self. But then this begs the question of how many types of identity are there? And there are 3, and the personal internal one is one of them. The second type we need to talk about is physical distinctiveness. It's the meat and bones that we call a body. Since this is the one that's most easily observed by other people, oftentimes this is the one that a lot of people will assume is the one that is the most real. I mean, the atoms themselves do exist, so, you know, I guess they do have a point there, like they do exist. What is there, you know. So this is typically what people use for things like first impressions. For me, this means that a lot of people will see that I am tall and gorgeous and beautiful and not at all tired. And many people think that when they talk about the trans issue, they are talking about physical identity. And they're talking as if that is the only type of identity that really matters or really exists. Now, don't take this too much out of context, because sometimes conservatives do have a point. For many situations, there really are only 2 sexes. The one I have with your dad and the one I have with your granddad. This type of identification is almost always external. There are not a ton of cases when a certain physical attribute of our physical bodies influence the way that we totally perceive ourselves. There are certain things. There are things like beauty standards, and there are things like gender expression, and blah, blah, blah. But things like your hair color, most people don't care that much that they would identify by their hair color or by a skin spot somewhere. And I think a good example of this is that very few people, I think, identify by the fact that they have 2 hands or 2 legs. If you lose one of those, you will stand out because of it, and that can lead to some ideas of identification. But like, I don't know anyone who identifies as a 2-legged person, even though, of course, most people are. And that shows to a crux of what identity really is. It's mostly used to distinguish ourselves from other people. And the more types of labels we can accumulate, the more ways we can stand out. Well, that's where we end up in the exciting field of social or public identities. Identity has to be discussed on a public policy level, because otherwise we don't know who is who and how to pay taxes and how to fund society and how to operate as an interdependent modal group of humanity. How do we do that? In order to run a society, we need to know who is who and what makes them different from anyone else. These are things like your name. It's still possible to share that name with someone else, which is exceptionally common among trans women, but we might still have different physical characteristics and other things that make us separate. We are still not the same person. Me and Mia Moore are not the same person. Your social security information, your tax information, your job, your class status, things that have not existed in human existence until quite recently, just because we have society now. Bad idea. Public policy has to, for bureaucratic reasons, simplify down the totality of human experience into things that fit onto forms. And preferably not too many forms, because then people would do nothing but fill out forms, which I know the tax offices love to do, but not the rest of humanity. And because of this, oftentimes these public identities are sometimes enforced on actual individuals whose personal or social identity might not fit that well with it, which can cause them friction. Historically, we can learn something from this, which is why I win over the philosophers. Why am I causing beef? Take, for example, my Vaterland, Sweden. For a long period of Swedish history, there were 4 rigid social classes. That is peasants, clergy, burghers, and nobles. And these classes are rigid, and they are the only types of people that you can be. When we think about social class in modern terms, we oftentimes view it as either your personal relationship with means of production, if you're correct and a Marxist, which can, in theory, change, or if you view class in a more vague way, you might view it as the level of wealth you have in society, which again can also change. Going back to my example in Sweden, You could not change class. That's not a thing you can do. You are a peasant. That's just what you are. That identity is enforced upon you by law, by society. And it's so socially ingrained that many people across the social classes here are willingly enforcing it and also self-identifying with it because it is the way the world works. Knowing what class you are and what class other people are is exceptionally important, especially in medieval history, because you need to know whether or not the person that you are talking to is a person above or below you in class status. And that changes the social rules that you need to engage with them. But if you're watching this video, odds are you are from the present. And that probably means that you don't see these classes as being as absolute as they were seen historically. This rigid way of viewing public identity and then enforcing it on people so that they can conform to society showed its worst face in terms of eugenics, when people would view the public category of criminal as being something that was maybe even genetic. Surely that is something that you can get rid of. Of course, we know that the identity label of criminal is only a public one. And when you try to push it on to people, either as a personality type or even physical identity, it doesn't work out that well, because we are not ants. Human beings are not ants. We don't have soldier castes or criminal castes, but I do believe we have architect castes though. But a lot of people still believe this. Maybe not on a fully conscious level, although there are definitely those types of people as well, but also on a subconscious level. Because as much as you want to, you can't identify your way out of being a peasant. That's not something that you can do, unfortunately, as much as I have tried. You might identify as a clergyman all you want, but unfortunately, Swedish nobility says no. And stepping back to modern times, we know that public identity is not just social hierarchy or social class, but all types of public forms of identification. But here's the thing, our passports and like the government doesn't have information about the arrangement of our organs, or by the specific interests that we have in the world as personality, because they don't really matter. Or rather, they don't matter that much for, normal day-to-day operations. This is not always the case. And it varies between nations and whatever society you are. Because, they are social and public identities, which then depends on which public and which social. I know that in America, you still put down your ethnicity when you're applying for jobs and stuff, which seems to me shouldn't be legal, but it also depends on where you are in your society. Like if you're at work, you will categorize and view yourself very differently than you would if you are hanging out with the boys on Saturday. When I was in politics, I was the second coming of Napoleon Bonaparte, future Empress of Europe and ruler of the world. But once I left politics and became a full-time YouTuber, allegedly, I don't know. And this is the level that people who are talking about trans people actually operate on. They don't really care about things like objective biological reality. I mean, they do care, but many of them genuinely think that the way public identities work is the way that all identities work.
What about intersex individuals?
I don't even know what that means, ma'am. Gender is not a social construct. It's firmly rooted in biological reality.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
I said gender is not a social construct.
Okay, so again, intersex. Do intersex people, what about them?
Yeah, those intersex individuals are still XX or XY, so you can't change that.
Sure you don't want to?
Andy doesn't know.
Because publicly, for the purposes of national reproduction, there are only two genders. Don't take that out of context. Now, if some evil people are wily, and many of them are, they will claim to operate on the idea of physical, objective, permanent identity, even though they are technically operating on public identity. Because it's a lot easier to convince yourself and other people of your opinion if you don't even frame it as being an opinion. We're just talking about facts.
the truth that is rooted in our biblical understanding that God set forth from the beginning of creation is that your gender is fixed at birth and you cannot change it.
So here we have 3 different ways to categorize the various labels that we use to identify ourselves and others. And these types of identity often overlap and interact with each other and change one another a lot, which is complicated, but that's just because human beings are very complicated and brains are very complicated, and we can't expect to understand all of that immediately. So where does that leave us with the questions? This question is actually a bit harder to answer than you might think, because I'm on the internet, which means that if I say the wrong thing, people will be very upset with me. But hopefully I'm a small enough channel where I can get away with basically anything. I've done it before, so who knows. Oftentimes, when people on the internet, especially when it comes to trans people, we often speak about identity as being a being in itself. They want to reinforce the label itself as being self-fulfilling. I think that this is perfectly a fine thing to do, but I think maybe it's not the most healthy way to do things. Now, listen, before anyone comes after me, I'm not going to go against that type of argument, but I am going to maybe contextualize it a little bit and maybe talk about why people think about identity in that way. Because I'm not super sure it's correct. Bear with me on this. Bear with me. Hold on. Stop going to Twitter. Stop going to 4chan. I don't need it. Unless you're there to call me elf Mulder again, because I like that. I think a lot of people think about identity and labels as if being objective truths, and that finding out who you are is only a matter of self-discovery. People want to be sure of who they are. For example, I have a number of friends, some of whom have since transitioned, talk about discovering their true selves by using LSD, which... fine. But here's the trick, right? I don't think, really, that anyone is looking for the correct word to describe themselves. I think, instead, people are looking for an excuse to do things that they want to do. Think about it like this. All right, think about it like this. Let's say that you are thinking about transitioning, hypothetically. What does that mean? Like, what do you want to do? Do you want to inject estrogen? Do you want to have a certain lifestyle? You could technically do those things, no problem, without using the label that you are using. It doesn't make you any less of a man, because if you're just like a guy and you're doing estrogen and you're doing a bunch of stuff, right? Odds are people will start to maybe question why you're doing that. Like, what's going on? Because you're acting outside of the traits that people would expect out of your current identity, or rather the identity that people label you as. But if you say that I identify as transgender, then people will hear a bunch of traits and expect those traits, and it just becomes a lot smoother in the whole social expectation of everything. Not to mention the fact that a lot of healthcare is going to be withheld from you if you don't use the correct label, regardless of what you actually identify as. But if we use identity to operate in society, why do we even need an internal sense of it? Why does it matter what I think about myself if really the primary use case of identity is to operate, you know, as a social group? It's because identity, not just for trans people, but for everyone, it's not just a type of descriptor, but it's a way to view your own aspiration. We use these labels aspirationally. There's a great bit about this in the book Atomic Habits that I've just been reading because, like, again, I have ADD. The book is like, it's pretty good. It's a self-help book, but it's like, I like it. It encourages you to think about the person that you are and the person that you would like to be and the habits that you would like to do. Instead of pushing yourself to do habits that you might not want to do, it might be easier to recontextualize who you are. It's not, I gotta go out jogging. I have to go out jogging every day because I want to build up that habit, and if I don't do it, I'm gonna feel like shit. Rather, you should think about yourself as a jogger. You don't have to jog every single day, But I mean, if you think of yourself as a jogger, aspirationally, you are more likely to pursue the traits that you associate with that. Because I do know a couple of fun girlies who do, kind of, semi-jokingly, identify as girl bosses. Some people who, you know, live in the Stockholm rich side and are entrepreneurs and don't agree with me on many types of politics, but you know, sometimes you gotta go on with the girlies. Some people will identify with a label because they would like to inhabit the traits associated with that label, such as go-getting and entrepreneurial. Now, the reason trans people don't really want to talk about gender like this is because, of course, fucking everyone is attacking us all the goddamn time and saying that I am aspiring to the traits of these things is kind of ceding ground a little bit. It's opening up the label for the discussion of what it is, and that doesn't typically go that well, especially in the current debate climate. And I think this is one of the reasons why it's become a lot more common to say that I identify as a trans woman, because for a long period of time, that's not really how the terminology went. For a long period of time, it was I identify as a woman, and I am transitioning to do that, which means I am a trans woman, but I don't identify as a trans woman, I identify as a woman. Trans woman is not an internal identity, it is a physical description of a physical reality of what I am doing. The identity is woman, the description is trans woman. And today that is becoming a little bit muddled. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. In fact, I actually think that's quite a good thing, because it takes away a lot of the stigma that used to exist around transitioning as an act rather than as a type of identity. So identity is not just a useful thing to describe each other and ourselves, but they're also a way for us to motivate ourselves and to show that motivation to other people. Identity labels then can serve as a type of guideline towards the life that you would like to live. So this is not to say that self-identity is in any way wrong, but it's rather to say that self-identity is oftentimes an idealized version of yourself. It doesn't have to be completely fully accurate based on what that would even mean, because think back about the man who identifies as an architect again. That person could just as well be a person who, when talking about his friends, being like, yeah, you know, I'm an architect, but that's just a day job. I really identify as a progressive rock musician. So despite the fact that these two different architects might do the exact same things and exhibit the same type of behavior and do the real objectively same things, they might identify completely differently. One might want to exhibit the traits that they hear when they hear the word architect, while the other one would like to exhibit traits that people associate with the term prog rock musician. Welcome back to what looks like an office room where I am going to fire you. I'm sorry, but you weren't up to quota this year. You're fired. So this is the part where I was supposed to do a shout out to my friend's company last year. Like 2 years ago, my friend Daisy reached out to me about her new business, T-Net. And I said I would give her and Charlie a shout out. So here we are. She even asked about like how much it would cost to sponsor one of my videos, but like, come on, we're all in this nightmare world together. It's the least they can do, like almost 2 years late. T-Net offers informational seminars, workshops, and similar things about trans identity and trans topics for individuals or businesses wanting to increase their knowledge about such topics. They also do consulting for businesses, healthcare providers, schools, and such. And they also got kick-ass stickers on their storefront. They actually sent me a bunch of nice stickers, but unfortunately I misplaced them in some moving box while I was moving across Europe at the time when I was making this video. So alas, I can only show you the ones on their storefront, but you should definitely get them yourself because they were fucking great. They also have useful pamphlets and other resources that are super useful, especially for people working in public-facing roles or with young people in general. TNET is based in Albuquerque, but if you're interested in their services, despite being halfway across the world, you should still contact them. Send TNET your money, pay for their goods and their services. Do it, they're good. I'm giving them free advertising because it's a good business. They also have good posters. So like all of that is fine and good and blah, blah, blah. But what if not? What if not? What if after all of that, not, have we considered not? All of that we previously talked about, sure. But what about answering the question though? How can you be sure you are who you are? None of this is really touched on that. This question turns out to be a bit more difficult to answer than maybe I thought it would be. The problem with this model is, what if you can't? Like, what if you can't? Like, what if you aspire to something, but you can't. The world says no. What do? Do you abandon the label entirely? This is a discussion that I think plagued online trans discourse like 5 years ago or something like that. So I'm well and truly on the ball on this question. But let's say that you identify as a trans woman, but you can't do basically any of the things that you would like to do in order to fulfill that identity, to reinforce that label, like feeling a lack of safety to be either openly trans or just to be like outside the way that you would like to be, or can't get estrogen the way you would prefer, hypothetically. Going back to our architect example, you better still be rotating that fucking architect in your mind or I'm coming for you. If an architect cannot reinforce that identity in any way at all, ever, are they still an architect? I think most people would agree that if they have been an architect at some point, they can retain that title, kind of. What I have generally seen when examining identity labels is that if you attain a new one to replace the old one, typically you no longer go by the old identity label anymore. Like, if you are an architect, but you retire, odds are, if someone were to ask you sort of like what's your career identity, sort of, and unless they say retired, they'd probably say that they're an architect. Now, if you were to view identity labels as just being words, and if you were a pure descriptivist, you would say that no retired person is an architect because they are retired, that's what they are. Everyone is what they're currently doing at that time. But no one does that, right? We all kind of make an exception when it comes to identity. Like, you could say that I'm a gardener, but you can't say I'm gardening when you're not gardening. Like, if you're making a YouTube video, you're not gardening. You may be a gardener, but you're not gardening. I'm a little bit of a label anarchist on this. I have actually a great memory of being in theater school, because of course, and referring to myself while putting up a play as an actor. I don't remember how this came up, but I remember saying to my class that, like, we are actors and we are acting here and that's great. We're having a good time. And a lot of people pushed back on me and said, no, we're not actors. We're training to be actors, but we're not actors yet. And I had a hard time understanding why.
Acting.
If we are talking about what we are doing and what it means to be doing the thing and sticking a label on that, we're really talking about what expectations that label has. For them, the term actor meant professional, working in professional theater acting. I think I would refer to anyone who does acting, whether it's on the opera or if it's, you know, at a dinner party for your friends, as being an actor, because they're acting. That doesn't mean that the word actor doesn't mean anything. It just means that there are a different set of expectations that I draw out from that term. In that example of the architect, that person cannot or doesn't reinforce the label of architect anymore. And in many situations, but not all, they could either retain that title or lose it in lieu of something else. Before you pursue another career or before you retire, but you don't have a job and you can't reinforce the title of architect, what are you? I think that this is a question that a lot of people who have become recently unemployed do think about quite a lot. Who am I anymore, even? Totally not me after quitting politics, which I thought was going to be so easy. That's so fucking easy. But then that's fine. I mean, maybe you would like to be an architect, but that's not the end of the world for a lot of people. And typically that title isn't instantly replaced for something else or something shameful. Odds are maybe you can find another job that's in a similar field or something like that. Like you can always do something. Bringing things back to trans people though, things change a little bit. Because gender identity is, more often than not, something that is prescribed by other people onto another person. So what happens if you can't reinforce that identity anymore? Well, there is another one that's lined up right behind you that will be prescribed to you by the rest of the world, and you can't do that much about it.
XX or XY, so you can't change that.
And because labels contain within them traits, they also contain within them expectations. That also means that you can fall short of that expectation. Your architect, your hypothetical floating architect, maybe hasn't done that good of a job lately. I mean, they are still designing buildings, but maybe they're not doing this kind of stuff that they were hoping to do. Maybe they are designing ugly buildings because that's the only work that they can get. Because maybe they don't feel like they're as skilled as they need to be. So they feel like they're maybe not really an architect, even though they identify as one, which leads to a type of incongruence with their own expectations of who they are and what they think they are living up to. And when people can't live up to their own expectations, they feel bad. And I don't just mean like a little bummed out. I mean, we have a word for this. It's called a midlife crisis. A time when a lot of people will drastically try to reinvent themselves, try to come up with new identities, new labels, new hobbies, new personality, because they feel like they are not happy with what they have currently. This question matters so much to people. People become depressed, people have crises, if they don't feel like they have a sense of who they are, or if they feel like they're not living up to their own sense of identity. And I get it. When I left politics, I was sure that I could step right into making YouTube videos like no problem again. But it was quite difficult. I used to work with people, now I work alone. I used to work bureaucratically, now I have to work creatively. The way that I thought about the world and myself in it had radically changed, and I became radically depressed. What sort of traits do I want to aspire to? What kind of traits do I want to be associated with? When I was in politics, that's quite easy. That's just world domination, baby. But as a YouTuber, I feel like the traits associated are not that great. Can you see where this is coming with the gender stuff yet? A lot of trans people will feel like they are not living up to the expectations that their identity is setting for them. In fact, this is a very common cause for detransitioning. A lot of people just feel like they can't do it, and so they stop identifying as that thing, even though they might still live the way they used to do before. Them feeling like they can live up to their own aspiration is causing itself a type of negative self-thought. And I know some trans people who have had both a midlife crisis and their own gender crisis and describe them as both being radically similar to each other. This is one of the reasons why I don't really like talking about identifying as a trans woman makes you valid, because I don't care. All trans people are valid because being trans is just being trans, you know what I mean? Like that's just, the label is just a descriptor of what that person is. In my mind, there's no expectation there, but a lot of people have in themselves that high aspiration. And when they can't live up to their own sense of expectation, they feel like they are not really what that label means. One way to deal with that is to reinforce a label, that the label is self-reinforcing. If you identify as a thing, you are that thing. But you can also take away expectation. This sounds dangerously close to lowering your ambitions, which is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is maybe people shouldn't feel like aspirations are qualifying for that label. And there's another crux here. Because in order to be aspirational, I think you need to know where you are. If your goal is to get from destination A to destination B, you need to know where destination A is also. And if you know that, then that's fine and dandy. But if you don't, maybe that can disrupt your journey a little bit. I've mentioned this previously in videos, but after more than a few acquaintances who are intersex reached out to me and told me that, like, hey, you have traits that could potentially be some shit's going on. You should get tested for that. So I asked, like, how do you get tested for that? And they were like, just talk to your doctor. And I was talking to my doctor, and the doctor was just like, no, we're not gonna do that. So I asked my friends how they got tested, and they all got tested at birth. And so I spent like 9 months just contacting various clinics all around fucking Sweden, trying to get a doctor who would be like, hey, can you test my genes to see if I have this specific thing? Because it would explain quite a lot of my health history and also a lot of like issues I've had with my hormone treatments and yada, yada, yada. And I can't do it. I can't fucking do it. I can't find a fucking doctor anywhere who will do it. And while that doesn't really matter, because like, I mean, like I'm still me, who cares? To me, means something in terms of being trans. Because what if my entire life before my transition wasn't just wrong identity for the wrong body? What if the gender dysphoria was not solely in the brain? What if there was gender dysphoria in the genes as well? You know, that to me that matters. And a third jumble here is time. Because as we grow and age, as I hear some people do, we change. We change our minds. We prefer new things. We change not just from aging and growing, but also by the choices in life that we make. But when people talk about, are you sure that you are trans? A question that is commonly asked when you are trying to transition. Maybe at one point, 10 years ago, you're pretty damn sure about a specific thing. And being sure attaches yourself to that label. In my case, trans woman. But what if that is not? But in the period of time since then, terminology has changed. The way people talk about trans women as a term has changed. The community has changed. The things that go into what you would assume reinforces the label have changed. And because of that, maybe that label no longer really fully applies to me. I mean, like, this is not a detransitioning video, don't get me fucking wrong, okay? Like, I'm still fucking... But it can be difficult to examine yourself through your present lens. Maybe 10 years ago, you became an architect and you locked yourself into that identity hardcore. Now, 10, 15 years later, are you still sure that this is what you want to do for the rest of your life? Are you sure? 100%. When it comes to trans people, a lot of us are assumed to require to have this confidence continuously, because otherwise what's the fucking point? If you do irreversible changes, what if you change your mind after? But I do think what's happening here is that people demand a certainty that honestly no one has after a certain amount of time. Just because how can you be sure that you today would make the exact same choice right now as you from 10, 15, 20 years ago? Because that's a different person. Entirely. Hank Green made this point quite well in a speech that he made. I don't think I can use video from it, so I'm just going to paraphrase it, but this is here if you want to see it. Where he talks about feeling loyal to a past version of yourself that first literally knows less than you do because time has passed and you learn new things, and second, literally doesn't exist. And yet society still demands, essentially, that everyone has something to aspire to, an identity that they can have or pursue. Whether that comes in career or personal identity or gender, whatever, it doesn't matter. Like, whatever it is, we still demand that people do that constantly. And I don't think that's good. Which brings me to, why do we need to be sure? I think that quite a lot of people can get stuck there. And listen, this is not just a trans thing. If you're not doubting your sense of self at least once in your life, what are you even doing? What are you even doing?
I pump those numbers up. Those are rookie numbers in this racket.
There's also like some grief in that too, right? Because I still feel very loyal to a version of me that doesn't exist anymore. The person who, like 15 years ago or some shit, started thinking about gender. I'm literally a very different person to who that person was who made those choices. But I still feel loyal to what she did and what she wanted. I feel like I owe something to a past version of myself, that the aspirations that she had is something that I have to live up to. In a video that I made a long time ago, I made the statement that it can be difficult to talk about what you want out of your trans identity and subsequently how you can be sure about that because of the pressures of outside people. Because it leads to situations where you don't know if you want what you want or if you just want what you've been told that you want. Sometimes it can be difficult to know if you want what you want or if it's what your past self have told you that you want. And so the question of how can you be sure who you are is impossible to answer without first knowing yourself. Who do you want to be? Not who are you, who do you want to be? Who am I is one of the most fundamental questions that anyone can ever ask themselves, and most people can never come up with a good answer to that question. So what do you do when suddenly you find yourself in a situation and your mind is screaming to itself, who am I? Who am I? How can you be sure that you are who you are? I don't think you can. When we ask what makes us valid, or ask the question, how can you be sure? We assume that validity or certainty is possible and needed. That there is some unchanging essence and that all you have to do is find it. But what if Heraclitus was right? What if we're just rivers, constantly changing and never the same twice? Maybe that's not a problem to solve. Maybe that's just how it is. Identity isn't the thing you discover or quantify, like your puzzle and trying to find the correct piece. It's a thing you do. It's the person you're trying to become through the choices that you make today. You don't need to be sure. You just need to be willing to become. If there's anything I've learned from making this goddamn fucking video, is that identity is flimsy, it's variable, it can be as solid as you want it to be, or as exchangeable as you need it to be. And like, listen, psychologists and neurologists and politicians and blah, 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 all those types of identity are kind of correct. Because it's all just words that we made up to describe ourselves, our place in the world, and each other. So, how can you be sure? You can't. How can you be sure you are who you are? Well, first off, you can't be sure. But I am who I am. And so are you. I was whoever I was yesterday, and I will be whoever I will be tomorrow. Maybe that's good enough. You know, I've been thinking about that letter. The one that started all this. How can you be sure of who you are? I realized that the person asking that question, they were looking for certainty. Something unchanging. Something they could point to and say, this is me. But that's not how it works. Not for me, not for the doggies on the prairie, not for any of us. What I learned out there in the desert, what I'm still learning is that certainty is a trap of the mind. The journey isn't figuring out who you are, it's deciding who you're going to become. Every single day. I can't answer the letter the way you wanted me to, and I'm sorry that I can't give you any proof. But I can tell you this, you'll be okay. Not because you'll figure out yourself, but because you'll keep choosing yourself over and over, even when you're not sure. This has been Radio Gender, your little jukebox in the pronoun wasteland. I'm Miss Twincon, and I'm here for you. Hi, and thanks for watching this video. Sorry it took so long to make. I've had a rough year this year and for a while. I moved across Europe. I quit politics, but then I ended up commuting for like 8 more months back and forth because I didn't actually fully quit. Because it's a lot harder to quit than I thought that it would be. Just too much fun. And I got sick a lot, it's just been a whole lot. But I'm back now and hopefully back to somewhat regular content, at least more regular than it has been for the last year. So thank you all for your patience, and even more so to my patrons, to whom I am eternally grateful. Now that I'm back, I'm hoping to get more active with the streams and the content and the whatnot. Just a regular old content mill. We're back again. Mia content forever. Mia Mulder content. 1,000 years Mia Mulder content. And speaking of those patrons, I want to give special thanks to 12 Tone, Aislinn, Aline in Green, Amy Lee, Andy Sophia Fontaine, Angelo Garcia, Athiet, Autumn, Balax Vince Sadel, Catherine, Corbosphere, Dana Ferguson, Dana Lotzgezel, Deanna Morandi Arizetto, Amelia Clark, Eric Owens, Fox Kent, Gina Service, Gwender Euphoria, Gwendolyn the Middling, Hyla Tracy, IPOAC, Gareth Arnold, Jason Haig, Jill Isabel Gary, Joshua Anelnick, Julia Helene, Justin Lowry, Casey Kyle Hampton, Kiara Wins IRL, Lane, Leonard Chavaz, Linus 2.0, Lucas M, Madison, Maeve Calloway, Marcus Smith, Mary Neckar, Maurizio, Michaela, Nia Pasaka, Njothbun, Northerly K, Nyakomame, Peridot, Perky, Rose Brunton, Scott E, Sonic Bread, Stansky, Thors of Mir, Travis Siobhan, and Wolfgang, the Grand High Exalted Wizard. Thank you. Howdy. My head is too big for the head.